Hello, my name is Chris Canipe, and I work at Reuters on the graphics team. And yeah, I'll start off with a bit about myself. I work in Kansas City, but I work for the Reuters office out of New York. That's where our main newsroom is. Before that, I was at Axios for a couple of years doing graphics as well. And before that, I was at the Wall Street Journal. Yeah, so I'm going to tell you a bit about kind of what I do and what we do, what graphics is, and how we tell big stories with graphics. I would be in Lawrence today. I really wish that I was in Lawrence in a classroom instead of doing this from home, but that's what we're all doing these days. Yeah, pretty, it is what it is. It is what it is. So let's get into it. So I've got like this whole presentation thing set up on, Google Slides, and I'm just gonna record this through Zoom. That's what I'm doing here. So hopefully it works. Yeah, okay, the presentation. Telling stories and sometimes lies with data biz with me, Chris Knight. Yeah, so charts tell big stories quickly. That's kind of the idea, right? We manage to, when we do our jobs well, I think, get a lot of information into a short amount of space. It's kind of high density visual information. Really good examples of that right now are all of the various coronavirus charts, and I'm just going to kind of walk through a few here. These, you've probably seen some version of this chart or any version of these charts in recent weeks. These show the trajectory of an outbreak in each country or in individual cities, and they all have some interesting things in common. Most notably that we have all kind of settled on this logarithmic scale presentation for showing the number of cases, usually from the 100th case or the 25th or 10th death in the country. So this one shows cases, this one shows deaths. And what we're doing here is comparing the outbreak by country because they all kind of line up in a really remarkable way, right? These charts show that every country that has had a major outbreak has kind of struggled to get the trajectory, the number of cases that come about every day, struggle to get that under control. A remarkable thing about the coronavirus outbreak is that the number of cases left unchecked tends to double somewhere between 3 and 6 days. So if you have 10 cases today, and in 3 or 6 days, you'll have 20 cases, then 40, then 80, then 160. And those numbers get real big, real quick, as we all know. And that's why we're all, giving presentations in our bedrooms. So here we are. Yeah, there's, again, lots of different versions of this. These lines that you see, the deaths double every day, every 2 days, every 5 days, every 10 days. Like, this is meant to be kind of a reference point. And it's really interesting to me. Like, this is a good example of how our vocabularies kind of line up on an idea pretty quickly. I think that if you had shown most people this chart 6 weeks ago, the idea of a logarithmic scale would have been kind of difficult to convey. And I think that at this point, like, it's probably entered our vocabulary, our collective vocabulary, pretty quickly. Nonetheless, here's a good explainer from the New York Times about what a logarithmic scale does. On the left, we have a linear scale, right? So the distance between 0 and 15,000 is the same as the distance between 15,000 and 30,000. But on the right, we go from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000. And these charts show, of course, the exact same data, right? The exact same data is plotted on these charts, but the Y scales reveal something interesting about the data. So in this case, if you have 15,000 cases in the United States and you have 45,000 cases in Italy, you might think, boy, I'm glad I'm not in Italy. Like, we're sure in better shape, or we're sure handling things better. But of course, we know that's not necessarily the case. The logarithmic scale allows us to make kind of a better comparison, right? Because what we're really comparing is the date or the rate, excuse me, the rate of growth in each country. Yeah, so let's look at a version of data sort of in this vein that is bad. So This chart was really interesting. I think kind of went under the radar as it was presented last week. This shows the COVID testing rate in the US over the last month or so. And of course, this is from a White House briefing where, a few short weeks ago, they were making crazy promises about being able to have drive-through testing everywhere in the country by the end of March or early April. And what this shows, seemingly, is that that cases, or rather that tests, are growing. Right, that looks like a pretty impressive growth rate. What this chart actually shows, if you look closely, is cumulative testing. Right, tests completed through April 5th. So the previous day's total is added to the next day's total all the way through, right? So that by the 5th of April, we were at 1.8 million tests conducted in the US. The problem with it is that to have that slope means that you're testing at a constant rate. You're not adding new testing capacity, but rather each day you're testing the same number roughly as you did the day before. So if you were to flatten that, this is a piece from Mother Jones that looked at this chart. And we have two different versions of the data here, right? The light blue is the cumulative test, just as what was shown here, and the dark blue is the actual daily test number. And as you can see, that dark blue line is relatively flat, right? We are not, in fact, growing our testing capacity in the United States. Let's look at some other types of charts, other stories. 2017 was the third warmest year on record, right? So again, this is kind of the kind of story that just kind of everybody does a version of. This is the one that NOAA puts out, and this shows temperature anomalies. This is deviation from a temperature average through the middle of the 20th century. And what it shows is that the temperature average was cooler on average before the middle of the century and higher on average towards the end of the century. And that makes sense because the average, the baseline period, is just the middle of this chart, right? So yeah, kind of a complicated concept, but we can show that different ways and maybe it clicks a little more. This is one that the New York Times did, New York Times again, showing the average global surface temperature over time. Each dot is a year, and of course, the higher above the line, it's hotter than the 1880 to 1899 average. Different baseline here, actually, in this chart, I think, not the middle of the 20th century. Here's one that I did when I was at Axios that shows kind of shows the data in a different way. We call this a heat chart, actually, and the heat in this case just means that it registers cold to warm temperatures, kind of in a waffle pattern. Yeah, cold to hot, 1880 to 2018. Here's another way to look at it, kind of a cyclical temperature view here. This one I think is from Bloomberg, based on the colors and the typography. And yeah, so lots of different ways to tell, again, like a big story in a small amount of space. Warning, bad data viz ahead. Again, this is, this is from the National Review. So a right-leaning, kind of a conservative news and opinion site. So this says the only climate change chart that you need to see, and it is basically a flat line, right? Average annual global temperature in Fahrenheit. Okay, well, what do you notice like right away about this chart that is maybe potentially misleading? Well, we talked a little bit about the y-axis already, right, in this presentation. So the y-axis in this case goes all the way from 0 to 110. Has the average global temperature ever been 0? Probably not since, before the dinosaurs, or above 110. Yeah, so very, very flat line apparently, but of course the story is all in here, right? Here it is kind of flattened out, the same chart fixed in a blog post at Quartz by Keith Collins. And this shows, if you squeeze your y-axis to an appropriate space, 55 degrees to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, we see that the line is indeed ticking upward. Another way to think about this is that if you had fever, right? Like if you had the difference between you being healthy and you being deathly ill, right, is like 104-degree fever versus your 98.6-degree baseline or whatever it's supposed to be, is that, as we know, like a couple of degrees in either direction you feel very differently. Your body feels very differently. The system that is your body behaves very differently when the temperature changes by a few degrees. All right, another big common story, things that we see a lot, we all probably have a visual vocabulary for, are weather maps, hurricane maps specifically. This is a really good piece that a guy by the name of Alberto Cairo did. It's in his book, How Charts Lie. I've seen him do this presentation before, and he actually wrote it up as an op-ed that ran in the New York Times as well. So that's what these are from. This shows a map that we're probably all pretty familiar with, or a version of it, which is like the cone of uncertainty, right, for a hurricane projection. So hurricane, when it's forecast, has kind of a general path it can go, and it's usually drawn this way. There's a cone, and then there's the kind of dotted line, which suggests its most likely path. So the question is, how do most people read this? And I think that most people indeed do read the chart like this as kind of a literal representation of what path a hurricane might take, right? It's a small hurricane, it gets bigger and bigger, right? Smaller cone, bigger cone. That's wrong, of course. Hurricanes don't get bigger and bigger as they get onto land necessarily. And of course, they don't follow a specific line. As we all know, they deviate. The dots in the middle of the cone correspond to NHC's forecast of where the hurricane center could be in the following 5 days, but there's a good chance that the actual center of the storm won't end up being any of those positions, right? This is the actual intended takeaway from this chart. So forecasts, modeling show that the hurricane could behave in any number of ways. Any of these dotted lines can end up being the path of the hurricane. And that's of course the right way to read a chart like that. Another kind of version of uncertainty as it shows up in charts is this one, also borrowed from Alberto Cairo. Polling. We do this all the time with polling, right? Where especially in the heat of a close race, you may say that somebody has a 3-point edge on their opponent. But polling, of course, is a very, very inexact science. It is a best estimation. It's a random sampling of a population. And that means that it has all sorts of uncertainty baked into it, as we would call it, the margin of error. So on the left and the right are the same charts, but different ways to show them, right? So 45.3% to 44.5% makes it seem like the no's in this referendum would have a slight edge, but with a margin of error of about 3% in either direction. That means that what we're actually seeing is that the yeses and the nos could be anywhere within this range, right? There's a 95% chance that the correct actual data point is somewhere in here. There's no way to know, but when we read charts, it's important to kind of have some literacy about the way that the data is being presented and what it actually means. Yeah, so let's talk about just kind of how we source and use data. Data viz requires data. What makes good data? Well, it comes from a trusted source. You know who collected it and why, right? So a trusted source means any kind of, it depends what it is, but most common stuff that we all kind of see every day are things like, I don't know, unemployment numbers right now, health information, COVID-19 cases, deaths. We're looking to, when we collect that data at Reuters, we have our own version of that data set that we have collected on our own, and we source it to state health departments across the country, right? So those are government agencies that operate at the state level that collect data from the counties and aggregate it up. For national numbers, we collect it from national governments. And that's just a way to say that we are, number one, transparent about that, but two, that all of our data is coming from an official trusted source. Economic data comes from, the United States, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or the Economic Research Council, or any number of various agencies out there. And in each case, you know who they are and why they collected it, and you know how they collected it, and you know that it is consistent over time. Good data is consistent over time. You always want to make sure that what you're comparing is apples to apples. Yeah, so let's look at some bad charts again, right? This is a terrible chart, and it's going to violate several of the rules that we just outlined. Number one, does it come from a trusted source? Well, what is the source? Crime Statistics Bureau in San Francisco. Is that a real thing? No, it's not. It's not a real thing. The Crime Statistics Bureau is not a real agency. Uh, you know who collected it and why. We don't. We don't know what that is or why it would have been collected. In fact, it's most likely fake. You know how they collected it. There's nothing about this that suggests that you would get to know any of that, nor that it would be consistent over time, right? Other things that are wrong with this. It just defies basic credulity. Blacks killed by whites, 2%. Blacks killed by police, 1%. Whites killed by police, 3%. Whites killed by whites. Whites killed by blacks. Blacks killed by blacks. Yeah, this doesn't actually really make basic sense. And on top of that, the imagery that goes with it is, you know, obviously meant to be inflammatory. So let's just toss this. Yeah, another one. 2016 election map versus government released crime map of 2013. Again, source, well, there isn't one on here. But also it just kind of defies like some basic things that we know about the world, right? 2016 election map, yes, that looks like an election map, although I don't understand why there would be gray swatches in counties in the Western United States. But beyond that, this lines up with the chart below, but it also lines up with population density, right? Every blue splotch that we see here lines up mostly with high density urban areas in the United States. That's just where people live. Yeah, here's what crime rates by county actually look like. And the way that we adjust this is that we report it per 1,000 people, right? We adjust it per capita. And when you adjust it per capita, you see a very different highlight in this, right? So areas like Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, by density, right? By actual, you know, per capita crime incidents per 1,000 people in 2014, we see that places like Chicago and New York and Los Angeles and Houston do not actually stand out as particularly dense so much as other places do, right? So there are definitely other places in the country that have a higher density crime rate. Yeah, good data is often handled badly, right? So data can be good, but it can be handled badly. Here's a good example. 5 major cities with the most murders in 2017. Chicago is at the top, then Baltimore, then Philadelphia, New York, and Los Angeles. Well, cities are what? Cities are geographic areas. Chicago is a geographic area that is actually, the city of Chicago is much, much larger than Baltimore. I forget what the population is. It's in the millions in Chicago, and it's like 300,000 in Baltimore, right? So that doesn't actually tell you a lot. If you adjust by per capita, again, you see that Chicago actually ranks much lower than Detroit, St. Louis, New Orleans, Baltimore, Newark, all the way down till you get to Chicago. So even though we talk about Chicago, right, Chicago gets this bad rap. It's not that crime isn't bad in Chicago. It's just that when you adjust by population, it's a very different comparison than it is to other cities in the U.S. Here's one, Obamacare enrollment. This is kind of an older chart, but it's a good example of just flat out lying with data viz. There's a rule with bar charts, which is that bar charts always should go down to 0 on the y-axis. This, of course, doesn't. This bar, the area of the bar on the left, is not really relative to the one on the right. 6 million to 7.0607 million, basically, right? If you adjust that out and actually baseline that at 0, these bars are much closer in size, right? So here we go, ghosted onto the chart above it. You have to go pretty far down to actually get to 0 and actually make a good, reasonable comparison with this. Good data can be handled well, right? So we can do everything right. We can use good data, we can handle it well, and still end up with something that's misleading. Election results are a good example of this. This is kind of like that crime map before. This is the 2016 election results by state, right? So there's a lot of red on this and a lot of blue on this. There's more red than blue, right? We know that Republican won the 2016 election, so that sort of makes sense. If we look at a county map, that looks even more the case, right? There's a lot more red on this map than there is blue, but we also know something else about the 2016 election, which is that the Democrat actually won the popular vote, right? Trump won the Electoral College, but Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 3 million votes. So again, right, we have to kind of check what we know about the world, which is that that more people live, more people live in urban areas than they do in rural areas, and people in urban areas tend to vote more Democratic. So this chart lines up pretty well with population density across the country, right? So let's adjust that. We call this a cartogram. This is a weird cartogram, and it's actually just kind of the gooey, flowy kind. But if you actually adjust each one of those counties by and size it by population, you have this kind of distorted mess, but you also have a pretty equal representation of blue and red on this map. A better way to show it is to use density of color, right? So density of reds and density of blues, and you end up with a map that looks a lot more purple. There are some very dark blues and some very dark reds, but there's also just a lot of colors in the middle. And that's because there's a lot of counties in the United States that just kind of vote 51-49 or 49-51, right? That it's not so, it's not binary. It's not either or. It is often kind of much blurrier, and this kind of gets at that a lot better. And then here's another one that uses kind of both methods. So pretty accurate map, but pretty messy map. You would never put this in the major newspaper as kind of your primary means of explaining election results to somebody. Here's another version that Randall Munroe did from XKCD, which I really like. And it shows just like, if you actually just assign a picture of a person where each represents 250,000 votes, this is what, you know, the population adjusted map of the United States actually looks like. Yeah, so it's just not a lot of people out west, right? So those big swatches of red and big swatches of blue don't necessarily line up with where people actually live and vote. With that in mind, yeah, I was going to show you a couple of other charts here. All right. Yeah, so this is a chart that's in the New York Times that has kind of evolved interestingly in the last couple of weeks. Coronavirus in the US, latest map and case count. You've probably seen some version of this circle map that shows the number of cases in the United States by county. Kind of like our election maps, it is basically a population map, right? The areas with the highest or the largest circles, the highest number of cases, tend to be urban areas, right? So Kansas City, St. Louis stand out in Kansas and Missouri. Chicago, of course, the New York, New Jersey area, we all know has been very hard hit, but it is also, it's where most people live. Los Angeles, San Francisco have actually had fairly low caseloads, and there's lots to unpack there about maybe population density, definitely public policy, how it's been enacted in those places versus how long they waited to do things like close schools in New York. New Orleans stands out here, of course. They held Mardi Gras in late February, and I think that maybe has had some dire consequences for them. But nonetheless, like, this lines up with things that we know about the world. It also kind of tends to hide the scale of things here, right? Yes, there's a high density of circles in New York and New Jersey, but this is by county, remember? So if we actually zoom in here, we see that those are like, that it's not one giant circle, it's lots of kind of big circles that all overlap with one another. And when you zoom in, it kind of does a better job of explaining what you're looking at. But what they've done in a new iteration of this map, I think, does a lot better job of it. This, if you actually click over here to this triangle version of the map, same thing, same data shown at the county level. It's animated, so it shows the evolution over time. But what you see when you actually show New York all by itself compared to the surrounding counties is that New York has had just an off the charts different level of outbreak in New York. And this is deaths. This is deaths only, right? But nonetheless, the highest concentration of deaths in New York is much, much, much larger than its surrounding counties. Yeah, I love this chart. They actually did a really good version of this for print as well. Let's see if I can pull it up here. Oh, I had it. Where did it go? Here we go. Yeah, you're seeing me just move my files around here. This was the version that actually ran on the front page of the New York Times this week, right? So not animated, of course, because it's print. It's 4 charts, though, that show 4 different dates and a very quick escalation and evolution of the number of cases. This is supposedly the very first time that the New York Times has ever broken the flag with broken the plane here with a data viz, which is interesting. You would have thought they'd have done that by now, but apparently this is the very first time they did it. Here's a close-up of what that actually looked like in print. Yeah, pretty cool. Okay, yeah, so all of that just to say that there's lots of ways to kind of show the same data to different effect and with different levels of obfuscation, or maybe just kind of changes the way that you interpret or the way that you see data. And yeah, that's kind of what we do and what we get super excited about in my world. Okay, so real quick, I'm just gonna kind of walk through the last part of this, which is to tell you a bit about, you know, how we do what we do, right? What is data viz? What does it mean to be a data viz journalist or a visual journalist? What it means is that I wear 3 very different hats and they all kind of overlap. One, I am a journalist. I am on the phone with people. I ask questions. I ask questions about the world. I certainly work with reporters. I certainly pay attention to the news and try to really understand things as best as I can in order to be able to explain them to people the best that I can. On top of that, I'm also a designer, right? Like I design charts, typography, color, all of those tools for the various kind of elements of what this job is visually. And on top of that, I write a lot of code. For me, that's mostly JavaScript. For other people who work in my field, that is JavaScript. It's also a lot of Python, or maybe a lot of people work in R. I tend to do all of those data tasks and visual tasks with JavaScript, and especially a data viz library called D3. How do you start? How do you start doing this, right? You guys are all in school. How did I start doing it? I went to grad school. I had worked in an ad agency for a little bit, so I had basic like design skills. I had worked with Illustrator and Photoshop. And when I was in grad school, I ended up great because it meant that I had skills that other people around me didn't, and I fell really quickly into doing data viz because I already had kind of a leg up and just found that it was a niche that I got to carve out for myself, and I really fell in love with it. Yeah, so basic design tools like Illustrator, Photoshop, QGIS, which is a mapping platform, and then Tableau, which is kind of another like codeless data viz tool. Basic data tools that we use: Microsoft Excel, R, SAS. Those are basic like statistical programs. Excel for everything. I use Excel all the time. I abuse Excel all the time for basic tasks. Basic programming tools: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Yeah, the more you know, the more you can do. How did I start? How do you start? Advanced skills, D3, it's a data viz library for JavaScript. R and Stata, powerful stats programs for data exploration and visualization. Those are kind of like the next step pieces. Honestly, I've been doing this since, I don't know, 2008, 9, 10. And there is still just gaping holes in my knowledge. I have cobbled together some semblance of a career and skill set with a very stubborn adherence to mostly JavaScript and Excel. So there's lots of different ways to skin the cat. Yeah, how do you get into it? You just start making things, man. There's no other way to kind of do it other than to really just get curious and start trying to make things. That's it helps to be in a place like journalism school, where you have hopefully you're in a newsroom where you actually get to report stories and look into things like city budgets and other things with numbers that are good local stories, and to just start playing with how you might display those things visually. Be curious, ask a lot of questions, make a lot of things, and then if you're like me, you're all this way in and you still feel like you just are always staring up the mountain and everything is hard. I feel that way all the time. But hey, I still enjoy that part of it. I really do. So there you go. I hope you enjoyed this. Again, my name is Chris Canipe. Check out the Reuters graphics page if you want to see some work by me and my colleagues, or my portfolio page if you want to see some work that I haven't updated in quite a while. I'm on Twitter, and of course, Reuters Graphics is on Twitter. And please follow us. Please pay attention. Please don't hesitate to reach out. If you have questions, email me, hit me up on Twitter. I'm around. All right. Well, take care. Hope you enjoyed this. All right.